I hope you're enjoying the RockCreek Climate Summit so far. I'm Laura Tyson. I'm honored to be a RockCreek Senior Advisor. I'm a professor of economics and business at the University of California Haas School of Business. I've been a member of the RockCreek Company Advisory Board since the beginning, and I'm very, very proud of the 2 decades of the firm's leadership in climate finance. I am really honored today to welcome Tom DiNapoli, the 54th Comptroller of the state of New York. Comptroller DiNapoli served in the New York State Assembly for 2 decades. He was a leader on climate and the environment and remains a leader on climate and the environment. He's been the state comptroller since 2007. He has oversight in that capacity on the New York State Common Retirement Fund, and he's worked tirelessly to align that fund and the portfolio towards low carbon and climate smart investments. Tom, you're a terrific partner on investing in sustainable finance, and it is a real honor to talk with you today.
Thank you, Laura. It's great to be with you and great to be participating in the RockCreek Climate Summit. We at the New York Common Retirement Fund have a great and longstanding relationship with RockCreek. Afsani Beshlas, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, and the RockCreek team have really been wonderful for us to work with. They've added value and helped us get good returns. So it's always a pleasure to be part of the extended RockCreek family.
Fantastic. So we're all part of the family. It's a great family. And I said in my introduction that you are a leader and a champion on climate action. Talk a little bit about how you do that from the controller point of view, the controller duties. No one really quite is sure what does a controller do and how do you link what you do to climate and finance and the environment.
Yeah. Laura, that's a great opening question, one that I get a great deal, even right here in New York, where the controller's office has been in existence since 1797, but people still say, What is that? What do you do? And I always say I have the best job in state government, but the one that most people don't have any idea what it is we do. So we have a very broad mandate. You know, I know obviously folks that are part of the summit come from all across the country. So in New York, we've kind of put together what in other states might be called the controller, the state treasurer, state auditor. We've kind of put all that together in one office and called the state controller. And then we've added in pension fund management on top of that. So, you know, our mandate is broad in terms of accountability and transparency, commenting on state budget and fiscal practices, auditing state agencies, you know, local governments as well. We're approving contracts and payments, so we have a lot to do with operations, handle the state payroll, some miscellaneous duties like returning lost money on claimed funds. We administer the state's oil spill remediation fund. And that pension fund is an important and awesome responsibility because in New York, for our state fund, the controller is actually the sole fiduciary for the fund. So we don't have a board, which is more typical even for the other New York pension funds. So that's a significant responsibility. We have 1.1 million men and women who depend on our decisions to keep the plan well funded. So we do the benefit administration part and we do the investment part. So when I became controller, because my background in the legislature had been very environment focused, I chaired the Environmental Conservation Committee for the last 5 years that I was in the legislature. I said, well, you know, what can we do to use the powers of this office to what we called back then, when I started in 2007, you know, how can we develop a green agenda? And, you know, so we brought someone on staff who had expertise on environmental issues and really gave him a broad mandate to say, you know, internally, what do we need to do as a state agency to model best practices as far as not just a climate issue, but broadly defined environmental issues? How can we use our auditing responsibility to ensure that other government entities, be it state agencies or local governments, are following best practices, state regulatory requirements, state law especially on energy, but other environmental issues as a way, again, to identify success stories that others could model. And then obviously with the pension fund, to use the power as an investor to promote an environmental agenda. And obviously a lot's happened since we began that in 2007, but it was kind of a unique positioning for this office, which is often viewed as just a number crunching operation, to really, develop a holistic approach to an environmental agenda.
Fantastic, fantastic. I think the state is extremely lucky to have you in charge of this. And I think what you've described is a very sensible organizational structure for a state to basically oversee a number of things which end up having very important interconnections when you think about the environment and you think about climate finance. So I congratulate the state of New York for the way they've organized this and for having you in this position. Let's turn to the fact that the success, the leadership of the retirement fund in New York in terms of its sensitivity and investment, its portfolio decisions on climate has been recognized. So that there is something called the Asset Owners Disclosure Project, and that found the New York State Retirement Fund third in the world. So basically higher, by the way, than the Norwegian fund that we all know about, right? And first in the US among pension funds in addressing climate change related investment risk and thinking about opportunities in that space. So how strong was the focus on climate when you took this over, and how have you made this progress? So you mentioned that you took the position on in, what you said, 2007? So basically this is a disclosure analysis of, I think, 2018, 2019. So you made a lot of progress. How did you do it?
Yeah. Well, it took a lot of time and effort, and I wish I could say, Laura, that from the beginning we knew exactly what we were doing, and we earned that kind of recognition right away. But it really was a process that unfolded over a period of time. It started, as I mentioned, with our hiring someone who's still with us, John Stouffer, really being a point person on environmental concerns across the agency. But then it really involved getting buy-in, from the various divisions. And I would say that climate was certainly a piece of what we were thinking about. But as the urgency of the climate issue and really the climate crisis, the climate emergency, whatever label we want to use, as that has become more apparent in recent years, the climate piece of the environmental agenda certainly, rose to the top. So, one of the big changes from an investment, our role as an investor, I guess I would point to two pieces. One, we really oriented our corporate engagement program to focus heavily on the E part of ESG. Okay. And really for climate to be key. And so that, again, it's internal resources, it's people. So started up, I guess, as a one person shop, became 2-person shop. We've added significant staff resources to that group, which is housed within the pension and investment staff. And that's been a very big part of our effort. And then the other piece from an investment point of view, we launched what we called back in the day, I guess it was either 2007, maybe it was 2008, what we called our Green Strategic Investment Program. And we had this very ambitious goal of trying to deploy $500 million in that program. Well, that program really quickly took off in a very significant way, and it's evolved in many ways. We have utilized the work of consultants, and we use Mercer to come up with a various scenario analysis in terms of what does the future look like? What are our holdings now? We're always trying to look at what our carbon footprint is of our portfolio. We launched with Goldman Sachs, so another one of our partners, what we called our a low emission index, because so much of our investments are passively invested through index funds. So we came up with this creative strategy to put $2 billion in there initially, and that's grown, I think, Now it's over 4 billion. And every time we added to the program, we realized we needed to do more. So we set up in conjunction with the governor, an advisory panel. We called it our Decarbonization Advisory Panel. I'm fast forwarding to 2018 now, to really look at the portfolio and say, what other steps do we need to take? And we got some very significant recommendations from that initiative that developed what we called, I'm giving all these titles, our Climate Action Plan, which is really our blueprint about what we want to do from an investment perspective. And so then we, that 500 million that I mentioned, that we started, over a decade ago, we added to it, and now we're up to a commitment of 20 billion from that $500 million of what we called it for a while. We changed from that green strategic investment. We called it our sustainable investment program. And now we call it Sustainable Investment and Climate Solutions Program. So our notion of sustainability is not just climate, but we have a particular emphasis on searching investments that are related to climate solutions. And again, we, in addition to our regular pension staff, we hired dedicated staff. Andy Seawell is our director of that program. And his job is to source opportunities that fit into that bucket of sustainability and climate solutions. So we've got about 11 billion of that 20 billion that's been committed. So we're still searching for more opportunities, but we're very proud of the fact that we're engaged with the companies we're invested in, but we're really wanting to move the needle in terms of not only identifying the risks in dealing with the climate issue to our portfolio, but the opportunities as well.
Right. And there's that question. So this 11 billion, you said, sort of you're still in the process of investing.
11 is invested, so we got 9 billion to go.
All right.
20.
So 9 billion to go. So, okay, so you're more than halfway there.
Yep.
I'm just interested, are those investments are you doing direct company investments? Are you doing it through various funds? I mean, how are you talked about it as strategic investing. Right. So in that sense, you'd think about investing directly in a company, perhaps. Right. And I just was wondering how you decide what your investment vehicles are going to be.
Yeah. It's a great question. And you're really touching on one of our challenges. So we're big.
Yeah, we're big.
Great. It's great in some ways, but it has its own unique dynamics. We're now at the end of our fiscal year. We're valued on a state fiscal year, which in New York is March 31st. Okay. We're at 254 billion in assets. I mean, we're huge. So so by definition, for us to do investment, we need to deploy significant chunks of capital. Right. So our ability to do, and our staff, frankly, is not large. We've been growing it. We've added positions, but I forgot the last head count, but it's maybe 125 people. Maybe I'm off by a few, but we're not as big as California by comparison. Either in terms of assets or in terms of staff. So we for us, a small investment opportunity is $100 million.
Yeah, right.
So to do one-off companies, and I'm often, when I'm out there, I'll often someone come up and I got this great company, and we just don't have the staff resources.
You can't, that level.
We just don't. So we do have to work with partners and count on them, to deploy the capital. But what we take is really an all asset class approach. So, we're not limited. I mean, obviously, the big part of our portfolio is in public equities. So we, looking, I mentioned the low emission index, that fund, and we're looking at other index possibilities for the future. But, private equity, real estate, we have now relatively new compared to the other parts of the portfolio, and infrastructure and real assets allocation. So, we really are looking for opportunities across the board. But we are totally reliant on investment managers, on partners. And, again, that's a challenge because a lot of folks are out there pitching.
Oh, yes.
Green investments, climate investments, but how green are they? How climate are they?
I do.
And one other thing I should throw out there, Laura, while we're talking about it, and this comes out of the work of that decarbonization advisory panel that I mentioned earlier. We very much take the perspective, because we're so big, right? We're in a sense a universal investor. We're everywhere, certainly through the index funds. We're broadly invested, and we want to be around forever. We're celebrating our 100th year that the retirement system has existed in New York, and we expect to be around for another couple of 100 years. So we're universal and we're perpetual. So, when we look at the issue of investment opportunity, we take the view that we want to be invested, right? There's other debate about how to deal with the climate issue that we may talk about with the D word.
Right.
But our jumping off point is not so much how you label, what you're doing, but we look at what we call transition readiness. So we're very supportive of the goals of Paris, and the question that we ask, whether it's a new investment opportunity or it's an ongoing investment, or certainly with our public equity portfolio, how are you comporting your business plan to the goals of the Paris Agreement? And while we understand we all have a long way to go, and we need to move along rather quickly, we want to know what are your plans for the transition to the low carbon economy?
Yeah.
So how could we be sure that you're in our investment with you will be good for the long term? That's where the sustainability word gets in there. And so the challenge for us is with companies that don't seem to be transition ready, where does that leave us? Obviously, that's an issue with folks we're already invested in. But for any new opportunities, it really, the question for us is, how are you contributing to that change that we all understand has to happen? It has to happen fast.
So in transition readiness, that maybe gets to the next thing I wanted to discuss with you, and that is you have set a commitment to net zero carbon in the New York retirement fund by 2040. A lot of the discussions right now on net zero by companies, by governments, by entities is 2050, not 2040. So you're coming in a decade sooner, and I wanted to know how you chose that target. Do you think we can achieve that target? I think that obviously you think that in terms of your investments you may be able to, but 2040 net zero is quite ambitious. So I'm interested in your talking about how you set that target and what you can do to really move to achieve it in your own portfolios.
Yeah. Look, it's an issue and a question we grapple with, as hopefully our conversation has conveyed. This process has been an evolution over a number of years on our part. And, I do have to point out that while, as sole fiduciary, I have a tremendous amount of discretion in this area, there are other points of view. And part of what was happening in New York is that there was a push for a legislative mandate in terms of, divestment limited to fossil fuels. And, we had a concern that was frankly too narrow a focus, because really the whole portfolio, the carbon footprint broadly needs to be reduced, not just, fossil fuels. And there was a real tug about that. And also the whole separate issue of do you want the legislature deciding where your pension fund money should be going? Because the climate or fossil fuels may be the issue today, but what'll be the issue tomorrow?
Yes.
We'll end up not with it. And one of the things our little commercial that I didn't mention earlier, we're not only big, third largest in the country, we're also always in the top 5 of best funded. I think we're at about 98% funded. So that's an enviable position for a pension fund. So we don't want friends in the legislature messing with what we're doing. So part of what we worked out with them is that we were going to accelerate the implementation of our climate action plan, which means that we are looking carefully first at the fossil fuel area and considering investments and perhaps divestment, and to really pick up the pace, not only of implementing the plan that we already had, but really that's where that net zero by 2040 goal came, because we looked at the 2050, and we work in concert with so many organizations out there. Obviously, Ceres, the Luber's team, we love working with Ceres, and we've been very plugged in with on an international basis with so many of the organizations. And obviously 2050, as you point out, is often the year that's pointed to. And we said, we're trying to pick up the pace with what we're doing. Let's challenge ourselves with a more ambitious goal. And so the 2040 really just became our own desire to ramp it up. Yep. I have to say, I'm not sure that the staff was as thrilled with hitting on 2040 as I was, but I think that's, look, if we're going to get to where we need to be, all of the analysis and all the studies show, and obviously the weather events we're experiencing now, what we're seeing out west, what's happening in Germany. This past week, we've had terrible flooding right here in the capital region in New York that people haven't seen in decades, if not longer. So having a more ambitious goal, I think, makes sense. And again, what I try to point out to people is that by dealing with the climate issue, we are attempting to de-risk our portfolio to protect the retirement benefits of our 1.1 million members. That it's about de-risking and then seizing the opportunities that are emerging on a global basis with the world community. And now, thankfully, thanks to Biden-Harris, we're back in on the Paris Agreement. There is a transition happening. So let's take advantage of the opportunities. But the bottom line, because I sometimes get the question from our retirees, what are you doing? Why are you talking about climate? We just want to make sure you have enough money to pay our pensions. Right. We are protecting, not just for today, but long term. Right. If you don't deal with the climate issue, tremendous risks to our investments long term. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So 2040, don't ask me to give you the exact roadmap as to how we get there and when, but we're going to get there. And it's forcing us to really accelerate what we're doing.
And by the way, I think so. You were a leader in the choice of 2040. It has been the case, I would say, in the last year, more and more companies and more public entities have gone to the 2040. Some of them, setting targets like electric vehicles, they've gone to like 2035 or so. So basically, I think you were the head of the game. I actually think that number's coming. Yet it's going to move from 2050 to 2040, and you're ahead.
And look, if we help to move the needle for others, because they say, well, if New York is doing it, why can't you? That's a good thing. But probably if we have this conversation a year from now, people will say, how come you're not at 2030? So
yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, forget that. Right. And the de-risking analysis, I've been working in this space in the academic community for quite some time. And so really what has happened here is the assessment of risk, the measurement of risk, the scenario analysis that the central banks are now requiring the banks to do, to say, you guys are making long-term investments and there's serious transition risks associated with those investments. You must pay attention. There's really a lot of development going on to improve our understanding of climate risk and to assess climate risk and then to make investments based on that. It's very, very serious. And I think, again, I would say it sounds like you've been a real leader here. And the financial markets and the tools and the financial regulators and the central banks are all moving in this direction. Okay.
But you're right, but it's still a challenge. Scenario analysis it's very in-depth, and it's very it's an emerging field. And again, just as with investments, there are a lot of folks out there that pitch you on, consultants that they can do this. And then, when you really drill down, very often we find that, it doesn't really improve upon what we already have. But the challenge, we can't do this internally, right? No, so really what you're pointing out is key, but our ability to access those that can provide us the thoughtful analysis in this area, we struggle with that. Now we've had some great consultants, and we continue to be out there in the market looking for it. But that's getting the right data that's been a challenge.
It is, and we have So I think it's interesting. As I think about this as an economist, you mentioned that there's a lot of the size of the market opportunity for this kind of investment is reflected in the fact that you have so many new funds, new fund managers, new advisors. As you could say, that's actually a positive, meaning it reflects the importance of the field. and it increases competition. But as you said, there's a lot of stuff being offered out there that if you take a close look, you realize there's not much behind it.
Yeah.
That is a real, I do worry about that. And what that means is that you, in your capacity, you have to use your team to really choose the right, the right ones.
Yeah. But you know what the challenge there is, Laura, as you can appreciate, our investment professionals, we have a wonderful team. Anastasia Turterchuk is our chief investment officer, and she does a great job, and her team does a great job, and they understand the importance of this. But they're very much used to basic questions like, "What's your track record?"
Right.
And to your point, there are all these new opportunities. They don't have a track record.
No track record. Track record.
So every time I push back with the investment fund, I say, "Well, how come we're not doing more and getting more money out and faster?" What about I got this business card at some conference. What about this one? But there's no track record.
There's no track record.
There may not be a track record yet. So, figuring out when to take the chance.
When to take the chance and the risk. Right? Yeah.
There is a risk. And this is a good thing. Pension fund investment professionals tend to be risk averse because they have an awesome responsibility. You're not just creating wealth for an individual. You're trying to deal with retirement security for folks that, the average pension, for most folks is, $25,000 to $30,000 in New York in our employees' retirement system. But that is the difference between, surviving and staying in New York, a high expense state, and having to move elsewhere. So I appreciate that they take that responsibility seriously. But I think that, certainly speaks to the need for, those that may be listening that have one of those new funds or new opportunities that they've got to understand that not just pitching us and selling to us the fact that this is great and it's going to help save the earth, which is, terrific. We still have the bottom line because I guess what I didn't say, but hopefully was implied, when we look at risk and return profile and any opportunities, especially the new ones, we're not putting a lower threshold for these climate solution investments. It's got to meet the same standards. So, so when you're putting your pitch together, not only sell us on a great idea, but if the fund or the team as a group doesn't have a track record, let's hear about the track record of the individuals that have put the fund together. You got to demonstrate that, that there's investment expertise behind maybe a great idea, but you got to show us the team and how they're going to make sure that great idea will, provide the return that we need. So we're not, again, sometimes when I get asked when I'm out there, with retirees or public employees, they get concerned. They say, well, it's great you're trying to do all this stuff, to deal with climate, but what about the bottom line? And I have to assure them we're not compromising on the bottom line. But there are some great opportunities out there, and we've seen them, and we've invested, we've done well. And look, there's always there's no guarantee with any of this stuff, right? Even with more traditional investments, there's never a guarantee. So we're open for business. So come to us, but we're going to ask the tough questions. That's
you're going to ask the right tough questions.
Right.
That's the right tough questions. You mentioned in one of your answers, and I want to explore a little bit this issue of divestiture. So you have used the term blunt tool. It is a blunt tool. You are interested in flexibility and best interests of pensioners, but you also have said you're going to look at the companies that are riskiest by 2025 and divest from them. And this is really investments in fossil fuels, trying to reach net zero. So talk a little bit about divestiture as part of your strategy.
Yeah. It's interesting. When I first became controller, and realizing that a big part of the responsibility related to pension fund investment, I said, wow, I'm going to get hit with all these ideas on where to invest money. And I have to say, almost from the beginning of my tenure, I spend more time answering questions about where people don't want us to put our money rather than where people want to put the money. And a lot of that gets into whatever the politics is of the moment. Gun manufacturers, investments in Iran, tobacco, go down the private prisons, go down the long list. And in some of those cases, we've done divestments, actually, in all of those cases that I just mentioned. The challenge when you're talking about the climate issue or energy issue, broadly, of which fossil fuels has been a big part of the traditional energy sector, is, you're not talking about selling off, $30 million in a, $200 billion portfolio. You're talking about billions. And so, the challenge for us, particularly because so much of our public equities, which is more than half of the portfolio, is invested passively with traditional index funds that have served us very well, both in terms of return and in efficiency. We manage the index in-house with our small but dedicated team. So the cost factor, in terms of fees, is very limited. But if you start pulling too much out of the index, you lose the value of the index with the way it's constructed. So I've always had a real concern about just a broad stroke, divestment, because it runs the risk of throwing our index strategy out of whack. So I'll say, just as an aside, there's now the emergence of fossil fuel-free indexes, and we're looking at some of those. So if they could mirror the traditional indexes, again, you get in the issue of track record, but, I'll leave that aside. So the issue of divestment, and I have to say, I never said we should never divest under any circumstances, because we have listed some of those categories. But when it came to fossil fuels, again, because of the size, I said, we really need to be careful. And I will say that as part of the climate action plan, we, and with, I would say, encouragement, if that's the nice way to put it, or pressure, if you want to put it in a more charged way of putting it, we did come to the position on fossil fuels, particularly, that if there are investment categories where, after we engage with the company or companies, and they're just not being responsive, then we have to consider divestment as an option. So, again, Laura, the jumping off point is for us not the definition of what the company is: a fossil fuel company, an oil and gas company, a shale company, a coal mining company. The question is transition readiness. Do you, even if you're in one of the dirty categories, do you understand the world?
Do you understand where you're going to have to go?
And where are you going to go? Because
where are you going to go?
We're going to make the assumption that these companies aren't looking to go out of business.
Right.
So therefore, their business plan has to conform with the reality of the goals of Paris. And so we've set up a process where it takes a lot of effort and it takes time, which is the other piece that I sometimes have to explain to people. When you're evaluating something like transition readiness, again, we get to the need for data, right? And that often is a challenge. Right. But we're doing it in a thoughtful way. So, we started an engagement with our thermal coal holdings, and really, drill down on looking at, the profile of companies and making the judgment on their transition readiness. Mm-hmm. And we had a universe of 27 companies that we were invested in, again, largely through the index funds. And we ended up divesting from 22 of those companies. So it was a pretty significant investment. We did the same thing for oil sands companies. We had 9 companies, 7 of the 9 could not meet the minimum standards. So I should mention, when we talk about transition readiness, we develop minimum standards that we expect from companies.
And those standards, that's work that you have done. You and your team have set those standards.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Right. And we encourage others to be in touch and follow our lead. So in the case of oil sands, we ended up divesting from 7 of the 9. And now the next category we're looking at are shale oil and gas companies. So we're doing it in a deliberate fashion. We are hoping to get the riskiest, or the dirtiest, if you want to call them that, fossil fuel investments to work it all through by 2025. So we still have a long way to go, but the assessment of transition readiness, looking at our minimum standards, that really is the jumping off point. So we don't say never as far as divestment, but we always try to remind everyone we are set up to be an investor, not a divester. and we will use divestment as a last resort. But hey, if we're going to all survive the transition that has to happen, we need even these companies to be part of that transition.
Exactly.
And, in that regard, I think so many of the European companies are ahead of us in the U.S. So we've got to get the U.S. companies to step up their game.
So I'm really interested in the minimal standards you are setting, the transition risk. How is that a field of assessment that is evolving? Are you getting people who come to you to pitch an investment and say, well, we do transition risk, or we understand transition risk? I mean, I'm trying to understand that very important tool that you've developed, and whether there are tools out there so that when someone comes to pitch to you, they say, okay, yeah, we get it. Here's our transition risk assessment.
No, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, you're absolutely right. It is evolving. So with our current holdings, we develop those standards, and then if it's a new opportunity, we certainly can, in a broad sense, apply the standards. Keep in mind, usually when someone comes to us, again, if they're meeting our size requirements, it's a fund, and so they have multiple, strategies with different companies. So so it's a little more macro than micro in terms of applying the standards. But there's no doubt that with what I'm hearing in terms of the conversation staff is having, that notion of transition readiness is becoming more and more what we're hearing. So, what we've tried to signal is don't come to us and say, we're green and we're not going to do any fossil fuel, no oil and gas exploration. Okay, that's great, but there's a broader agenda there, and it's not just the fossil fuel companies that have to be part of the transition. It's really across the board. So whatever the investment is, how are you dealing with the issue of what kind of greenhouse gas emissions does your enterprise put forth? Are you measuring those, and what are you doing to reduce them?
Yeah.
Are you assessing carbon footprint? I mean, that's so we try to get that out of every investment, and I think that we're not the only ones raising that. So I think that evolution is continuing, but I think again some of it is still in early stages and probably needs more analysis and development, and needs to be even more sophisticated than it is right now. But we're getting there. I think we're getting there.
Yeah, it's a process. It's transition too, in terms of
it's a transition to transition readiness.
People are they're working very hard on this, and I really admire the fact that you've been again in leading this effort with a relatively small team of experts working to move this forward. It's very impressive. We've hit on a number of the issues. I know that in your climate action plan, you basically talk about, well, we need to continue to identify climate assessment tools. We're worried about, do we have the right data, standardization? We've touched on a lot of these things. Are there other issues related to how to do this? I mean, so there's a lot. I will say, one of the things I do is I work on the advisory board for SASB. So there are a lot of organizations out there that are trying to standardize measures, to standardize and collect the data, and it's hard. It's a slow process. Yeah. I was just wondering if you've touched on this again, but in terms of your climate action plan, do you feel like that the progress, that in terms of data consistency, standardization, data quality, that there really is progress that's happening that's going to make this easier for all of us?
Yes, but we're not there yet. No. As your question implies, it's a challenge, right? So again, I think the Europeans are ahead of us.
Europeans are ahead.
No question about that, and it really does start with disclosure. I mean, because if you don't have the data. If you don't have the data, you can't even talk about consistency and standardization. So, in some ways, we're at square one. Even going back to when we did that low emission index, I mean, there's a weighting and an underweighting based on greenhouse gas emissions in a plan to reduce it. But if you don't have the data, then how do you even make a judgment about how to weight some of the companies there? So. So disclosure is key. Obviously, we'd like to see the SEC take a much more proactive role in this regard. And I think there's some early signs with the changing dynamic in Washington that will, we're hopeful that the SEC will play a much more clear leadership role in terms of helping us get the data, helping it be consistent and standardized across the board. But that is a limitation to our work. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. I too am optimistic about the SEC. I've had conversations during the transition. I do believe that there is a serious commitment at the top of the SEC to try to move the disclosure, the standardization and disclosure requirements to be more rigorous, to be the kind of disclosure and standardization we need in the future. Absolutely. So basically, I'm optimistic, but we are. And part of this now is, as you say, I think from U.S. companies' point of view, they need to understand that there are going to be requirements from their European operations on. It would be much more sensible, it seems to me, to have a standard set of disclosures and data, which would help these companies, that help the investors and the companies, because these are global actions. But we'll have to see. I'm optimistic, but. You were talking about your engagement with companies, and of course, one of the really interesting things that's happened is this article that basically was one of the pieces of evidence disclosing how a major company like ExxonMobil fights efforts to tackle climate change. So they're publicly saying, we support private climate action, Paris Accord, all the rest, but privately, the evidence in this particular article, and it's got a lot of attention, is that they're doing the opposite. What are your thoughts on a situation like that? I don't necessarily mean you can either comment directly on Exxon, but how do you? It's the issue is how you assess what companies are actually doing, even as they commit to the Paris Accord. Okay, yeah. And even as they put out nice plans that are plans that you might say, transition plan, this little greenwashing there. And then behind the scenes, they're fighting like mad to keep anything from happening that would require them to act. I don't know, what's your view on that in terms of divestment or your sense of companies, because you're dealing with companies too.
Yeah. Well, in that regard, I have no problem commenting on Exxon because I think that's a great case study. So whenever I hear Exxon, channel both of our Italian-American grandparents, I get agita, because our engagement with them has been, less than satisfactory. And it goes back, for, a long period of time. And, we had a shareholder resolution that basically said, develop a report that shows how you're going to adjust your business plan to the goals of the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. And we co-filed that with the commissioners of the Church of England. I figured if you got the Church of England on your side, that might help, right?
Yeah, that should really, right? It's non-denominational. You got everything.
Right. And they tried to do a no action, but there was a vote. The first time we did it, we got 32% or so shareholder support. And the second time, we got a 62% vote.
Wow.
So it's to the example that you put forward. They put out a report that didn't really answer the question. And they said, well, we gave you your report. So then, we and others had filed some other resolutions there, all related to the climate issue at Exxon, because they certainly had not been moving in what we consider to be the responsible direction. And it's a significant holding, obviously, because of their own, they've had poor performance and they're not the big part of our portfolio that they once were anyway. But still, it's a big investment and one we're concerned about. And they kept being successful at SEC, knocking these resolutions off the ballot. Again, showing no real interest in engagement or not even allowing votes. Right. So fast forward, what happened with the engine number one slate of what are we going to call them, dissident nominees or fresh new faces that understand the issue? And they were smart because they basically said, the company is performing poorly. I mean, just look at their numbers; they're way off, and they're not dealing with the climate issue in any responsible way. And we, like the California funds as well, announced publicly that we were supporting the four nominees on the Engine One slate, and remarkably, I think it was a shock to Exxon. 3 out of 4 won.
It was a shock. It was a
but I think that was such an important statement that, because look, I mean, you take BlackRock. I mean, they look where they went. I mean, so it's not just pension funds that have been talking about this. I mean, investors understand that you need to deal with this issue, and investors, I think, get it that Exxon, like too many of the American companies, are really behind in this area. So, what will it mean for Exxon long term? We don't know. I think it sends a very strong message that all of the traditional energy companies need to look at. We haven't gotten to the integrated oil and gas piece of evaluating transition readiness. So I don't know long term, how we'll be positioned with investments with regard to Exxon. But look, at the end of the day, they're big. They've got a lot of scientific intelligence there that if they put it to good use, they could be part of the solution. Be a sustainable company for the long term.
That's right.
That's what our goal is, So, boy, hopefully now they get the message.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They have the wherewithal, they have the data, they have the understanding. They can be part of the solution as a leader, as opposed to tackling and stopping.
And Laura, we voted against probably, for various reasons, but climate responsiveness is one of them. We've probably voted against more director nominees, especially incumbents, the past year than we have in any number of years. So we climate, again, it's not the only metric or issue that we look at, but climate has become an increasingly important one. And if we think companies have been resistant, we'll vote against their directors. And I think what you saw happen at Exxon, you're going to see happening at more and more companies on the climate issue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I my own experience, I've been board member of several big company boards, actually mostly off of them now, retired from them. My sense of board discussions in general is that it's just the case that these issues are becoming much more central to board discussions. They oftentimes start with audit and risk. So basically it's risk. Okay, you'll sort of say, what is the risk to this company from climate and from climate change and from the changes that are going to occur because of that? But in a sense, the kind of good news here is that you, as an active investor, are bringing that pressure on the boards. It's also the case that internally, I think well-managed companies are paying much more attention to this. Anyway, they get the risk. Okay, they see that it's material risk, which it's cost risk that they just hadn't thought about before, and now they are. So there's positive things going on there as well.
But I think we need to keep it up because look, let's face it, as in any area, there are always other issues that could crowd out, right? So we wish you were on more boards again, because diversity on boards is another one of our priorities. And we've made progress, as you probably noted, in terms of more women on boards. But now we've got to deal with the fact that there aren't enough Black and brown people on boards.
Yeah,
we need to be more aggressive in that area. And the whole, issues related to equity, diversity, and inclusion, that's become a growing part of our efforts, not just on gender and race and sexual orientation, gender identification, disability rights. I mean, there's a whole new area, a newer area of priority. But I always try to say to folks, we're not going to let up on the climate piece of it, And so for boards, some of their heads are going to be spinning if they've been on a board for a long time, because they're going to be pressed political spending disclosure, which we've always had.
Spending disclosure I'm going to say is maybe the hardest. Okay,
we've gotten a lot of agreements, but you know what? Now we're actually. I know we're going off topic. I'll just mention quickly. Maybe it's not only disclosure. Maybe this company should just stop doing political spending for anybody. Stay out of it. Stay out of it.
I agree with that.
Talk about de-risking, right?
The best part is just don't do it.
Just don't do it. Yeah. But that's why we got to keep up on the climate, because I don't want the boards to say, oh well, let's deal with these other issues because then they won't worry about climate so much.
No.
Climate is not going to take a backstage to these other very important priorities.
So the last question, in a sense, is I would say when I think about the whole climate challenge, climate space, this is ultimately going to be addressed by private investment and the power of the investment pool, the pool of investable funds to make that happen. There's a growing, and it's large, and it's getting bigger all the time. So that is what, to me, is going to really drive the change. And then when you're thinking about it from that point of view, you're making decisions about what to invest in to finance the climate change challenge. So maybe just at the end here is a little bit of, and you've touched on this before, if the power is in this pool of investable funds, including yours, how do you choose the most effective ways to make those investments to tackle climate change? It's really what this summit discussion is about. It's about climate finance. Okay.
Yes.
So I'd just be interested in you've touched a lot on this, but maybe some closing thoughts on that.
Well, I guess the good news is the overall environment, in terms of government policy, be it law or regulation, is moving in the right direction. Again, because of good changes in Washington. You got COP26 coming up. So from an international perspective, I think you're going to see more buy-in on this whole agenda. And I think from our perspective, again, we're looking to make money. So when I mentioned that $20 billion, sustainable and climate solution fund, that is the floor. That's not the ceiling.
Right.
So even our 20 billion, when you think of the trillions that's needed as part of this transition, we all have a long way to go. So I think what it means for us in terms of what we're trying to signal out there for the broader investment world is that we want to know what all the opportunities are that you can bring to us, whether that's more green bonds in terms of financing, whether that's a new index that deals with transition readiness and climate. If you got something in real estate, not just for new development, but for retrofitting, existing. I mean, I think the message is that we need very much an all hands on deck approach in terms of sourcing opportunities. And from the investment side, we need to continue to put more capital out there, to make sure that this transition that we're all talking about being ready for, in fact, can happen. Because I do think you're right. Government needs to be a big player. There's no doubt about it. But government cannot do it all. And in fact, because there are going to be opportunities to make money, why shouldn't private capital or pension fund capital as a category of that be there to take advantage of it? And because I'd like to think the public pension fund dollars are at least in some ways tied to some sense of broader societal responsibility, I think there's a key role for pension funds to play in this area. So, I'm proud of how we position New York in this regard, but given how awesome the task is before us, we need to do more as well. And we're going to continue to refine our policies and our procedures and our approach. We're going to continue to put more capital out there. And for those investment managers that want to work with us, just show us what you got. And we would look forward to having a partnership that's going to work well for us, make money for you, and help save this planet, because we all need to do that.
Well, thank you so much. I hope someday soon we get to meet. I found the conversation just fascinating, and your leadership is awesome, to use an old word. It's awesome. It's inspiring and awesome. Thank you very, very much.
You have an awesome career, and I think there's a diner somewhere in Valley Stream that we could meet, and you could check out your old haunts there.
Let's do it. Okay. All right. Take care.
Thank you, Laura.
Lovely to see you. Right.